Hello and welcome to the Magic Piano Advent Calendar. It's today, Monday, the 20th of December, and it's my great pleasure and honor to have Rex Lawson here to talk to. Hi, Rex.
Hello.
Rex Lawson is one of the founders of the Pianola Institute in London. And actually, I was wondering when preparing for this, when it was that we met first, and I couldn't really figure it out. I think it was something like 8 or 7 years ago in London. It was when I was still very new in this research at the Bern University of the Arts. I had worked with some piano rolls before. Of course, I had listened to piano rolls recorded on CDs, but I had still very little experience with real instruments and reproducing pianos, neither with scanning or digitization. And I just remember that when we first met and when you first invited me to your home and also to the home of Denis Hall with his wonderful instruments, that it was really a revelation for me to see these instruments and to hear you perform on them as a pianolist. That was something that opened up a new world to me and gave me a completely new understanding for these recordings. Since then, I had the great pleasure to ask you whenever I needed information or help with something, and I'm just so glad that you always had an open ear for me and helped me with all of your knowledge and experience. So thank you for being with me here for this interview today. We will, of course, at the end listen to a roll together, although this time it might be a bit different than before. Usually we have listened to rolls scanned in Bern and performed then digitally through our emulations and with a virtual piano software. This time I decided to use a recording that was made on one of the pianos of the Pianola Institute, the wonderful Steinway-Welte of Denis Hall. So for once, you'll have the opportunity at the end of this video to listen to a roll that was really recorded on an instrument. Yeah, Rex, I mentioned the Pianola Institute. I think the Institute is probably older than I am. Could you maybe give us a very brief history of what the Pianola Institute is?
Before I start, you were talking about when we first met, and I was trying to think, and I don't remember how many years ago it is, but one of the things that sticks in my mind is that you and a couple of colleagues, Kai Kopp was one of them, I think.
Yes.
You came to our house and we had fish and chips. I can remember we sat around the kitchen table eating fish and chips. And that seems to me is a pretty healthy way of doing things with player pianos. It keeps it on a decent basis, somewhere near the ground. Anyway, you're asking about the Pianola Institute. It started effectively in 1984. George Orwell's famous year. I hope that isn't a bad sign. It sort of came about, I had done a music degree at university and I graduated in 1970. So that gives away effectively my age. And I got hooked on player pianos in the early 1970s. And I bought various books about them and then started doing concerts because I was managing an orchestra at the time. And I had read in one of Arthur Aldhume's books that there had been concertos with player pianos and orchestras in the early days, in the teens and the 1920s. And it seemed to me it'd be quite good fun to do it nowadays with an orchestra. And the conductor of the orchestra, of which I was the concert manager, I was very lowly sort of position. I was the one who phoned around to get the players to come to rehearsals and put the music stands up and did the publicity. But he was a very easy man, very kind man. And he said, yes, that sounds like a great idea. So we got Percy Grainger to do the Grieg Piano Concerto in December 1972, which was the first time he'd played like that beyond his lifetime. I mean, obviously, there had been things in the 1920s, but we started him off again, and then he went to Australia for a bit with Dennis Condon and Peter Phillips. And then he came back here for the last night of the proms. Anyway, I had always felt that the player piano had had an unfortunate life, it seemed to me. After the Second World War, it had become an object of nostalgia, and it had ended up with people who were really more interested in the mechanics of it than they were in the music. And it seemed to me that that needed some form of counterbalancing. And by chance, I met in the late 1970s a man called William Candy, who was a member of the player piano group in those days. He was in his late 70s, and I'm heading for that soon enough in the next 5 years, I dare say. And it turned out that he had been the music critic, the music roll critic of the Musical Times and Gramophone magazine back in the 1920s. Now, I have all my father's old copies of Musical Times at home, and I'd read these reviews, but it never occurred to me that I would actually meet the man who wrote them, or at least wrote some of them. He wrote under the pen name of William Delasare in those days. And so you can see WD in the Musical Times. And all of a sudden, I was sitting next to him, drinking tea and eating tomato sandwiches, which his wife made. And we got chatting a great deal about the history of the player piano and so on. Bill had been a demonstrator for Blüthner's in London, player piano demonstrator, amongst other things. And Blüthner's in the 1920s and 30s were the agency for Hochfeld in London, because obviously it was a bit difficult with the aftermath of the First World War, I guess. And so Blüthner's had a reasonable establishment in London. And anyway, he worked for them and played Hochfeld rolls. And over the years, we became very good friends. I like to tell people that at the age of about 80, his wife was still writing love poetry for him, which I thought was very sweet. They were an absolutely delightful couple, and they remain a very strong memory for me. When he got to about 80, he said, I'm not playing anymore. And he said he regarded me with benign envy, which was a very sweet expression. And one day he told me that he'd decided to give me all his rolls, and there were about 1,000 of them. And that's really what got me started with setting up a library. I don't like to call what I have here a collection of rolls. I don't regard myself as a collector. It seems to me that collectors, I don't know, their self-esteem goes up if they have a large collection. And I've known a lot of people like that. I'm not the owner of these rolls. I'm the custodian of these rolls. And I only have them for a while during my generation. And one day they will go elsewhere. And that's very important. And that's how it was clearly with Bill and me. In his case, he passed the rolls on to another individual. That's a risky business if you do that, because you can't predict what's going to happen to that individual during their lifetime. But it's equally risky passing rolls onto an institution, because you only have to have 1 or 2 people leave an institution, and then the rolls can get overlooked, and the instruments too, which is one reason it seems important to me that these things should be distributed equally around the world, because competition is a good thing. The vice chancellor, who is the boss in this country of a university, might think, oh, well, these piano rolls are not important. But if they then see some other university doing something rather good with them, then they'll say, well, perhaps we should follow suit. Perhaps we should keep these things rather than get rid of them. Anyway, I'm digressing. The Institute itself, in 1981, I did my first big concert overseas with Pierre Boulez in Paris, which was effectively the world premiere of the 1919 version of Stravinsky's Les Noces. That's another very big subject, and I shouldn't get sucked into that. But essentially, Les Noces was designed originally to be a staged work with people in character and the musicians actually on stage, no doubt dressed up like Russian peasants and so on. It was a peasant wedding. It's designed for small forces. Stravinsky originally did a version for very large orchestra, and then he decided to change it to a very small accompanimental instrumentation with a pianola, 2 Hungarian cymbalums, a harmonium and percussion. He even said at one point that he'd designed it for 4 pianolas, but I'm sure what he meant was 4 roll-operated keyboard instruments. And the reason that it failed is not because they couldn't synchronize the pianola, though a lot of people like to say that, just as they do with George Antheil and the Ballet Mécanique, but it's because they couldn't find cymbalum players to play Stravinsky's music. There were some fabulous cymbalum players around, but they couldn't read music. And the cymbalum players that could read Stravinsky's music were not very good cymbalum players in those days. So that's why they abandoned it. And also because Stravinsky had sold the exclusive rights to Diaghilev for a 3-year period. And after about a year of that, Diaghilev had not seen any sign of the music. So Stravinsky had to change it very quickly, and he did it for 4 pianos instead. And I will say this too, that most choir conductors like to have a large choir because it makes them feel good to hear a lot of voices. But actually what Les Noces needs, and has never had during my lifetime, is a small choir, and it needs the musicians to be on stage along with the choir. But you need the pianola. You'll probably never hear that well in that version, but you really need to be able to hear the cymbalums because they give the most wonderful peasant effect, most wonderful village effect, which no other instrumentation does. Anyway, I met, there was a chap I hadn't met up to that point properly called Denis Hall. And with another friend of mine, they decided to make the journey across to Paris in June 1981 to come and listen to that concert. And we all got on famously well, and Denis and I became good friends, and we started going around attending concerts together, doing concerts together, and so on. And I talked to him, as I had to Bill Candy, to William Candy, this demonstrator. I talked to him about the idea of a Pianola Institute, and we set about founding one, but we had great problems, and it will give you an idea of why I was concerned about the pianola, really. We got a firm of lawyers to help us to set up a charitable company, but Companies House, which is the British registry of companies and their names and so on, they would not allow us to use the word institute and connect it with the word pianola, because they said the pianola is a terrible musical instrument. You can't possibly have an institute, because an institute is a high sounding educational establishment. So you can't use the word institute unless we will allow you to use it if you will give us a letter from an important musician, a musicologist, or somebody in an existing educational establishment. So I got the professor of music at my old university in Nottingham, who wrote a wonderful letter, and we sent it through the lawyers to Companies House, and they said, no, that isn't good enough. Nottingham University is not good enough. We want a letter from the professor of music at Oxford or Cambridge. And in fact, by chance, the professor of music at Nottingham in my time had gone on to become the professor of music at Oxford, a man called Denis Arnold, who was an expert on Monteverdi and so on. And so I wrote to him, and he was a very good friend anyway, and I still knew him. And he said, Rex, that's fine. Just tell me what you want me to write, and I'll write it, you see. So he wrote it, and we sent that down to Company's House, and they then said, no, that is still not good enough. We want a letter from the president of the Royal Academy of Music in London. So Denis Arnold then wrote to the professor, the equivalent, his equivalent at the Royal Academy of Music, and he said, this is ridiculous. You just tell me what you want me to write and I'll send it. So we then sent on a letter from the Royal Academy of Music, the president there. And at that point, they said, okay, we'll allow you to call yourselves Institute. But it took 3 goes to get that. And it does show you, I think, the sort of reputation that the pianola had, certainly in this country, which is what it really was, something that should not be thought of in terms of a serious musical instrument. Anyway, we got it. And we had our first concert in 1985 in December, with Percy Granger again playing the Grieg Piano Concerto and various other things. And it happened to fit with the first visit abroad of the Chicago Youth Symphony Orchestra. So we put on another concert in the Queen Elizabeth Hall, and there it's gone from then. And we've had pianola journals rather less frequently than we would have liked. They were supposed to be 1 a year, but every now and then it takes a bit longer. And COVID has been a problem this last couple of years. There you are.
But I think especially when we look at the journals and at the quality of the articles in the journal, that's another thing that certainly justifies the name of an institute, because these journals became probably the most important source to rely on in the academic world when referring to anything that has to do with the history of pianolas and reproducing pianos. And you mentioned that during COVID, it was more difficult to, of course, keep on the activities of the Institute and also the publication of the journals, but you did have the time to digitize all of these journals, and you published them on your website, I think for free now, so that anyone can access them. What gave you the idea to do that?
A mixture of things, partly that I felt it was the right thing to do personally, and she's no longer with us. She died a few years ago, but the company's secretary, Claire L'Enfant, Claire Kavanagh was her married name, a wonderful lady. She was quite a high-flying publisher at the time. She was a publishing executive in London. And she actually said, to try and convince some of the other people on the Institute board, that if you put them free online, you'll find that more people want to buy the hard copies as well. I have to say that hasn't quite happened yet, because we have a lot of hard copies here, and we send them out for a very small price, postage paid usually. But it came about through that, and in the end, all of us felt that it was just the right thing to do, to make these things available free. May I say that in the last 2 weeks, actually, I've bought myself a very good character recognition program, and I'm currently going through making those files, those journal files, searchable, which they're not at the moment. And in due course, probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks, they will all be searchable. I shall replace them so that at least they can be pretty much searched for names and composers and makes of instrument and so on.
Wonderful. I think that's an amazing service that you did for the entire community interested in player pianos. So I can only encourage everyone who might not even know yet that these journals are online to go to the website and to look at them, and of course also to order the hard copies if possible.
May I say just something small? It's been a particular passion of mine in some of the later issues to try and set down how the different reproducing piano companies recorded their dynamics. One of the problems with the player piano has been the amount of misinformation that has been out there for decades, I would say, and it's important to try and get it set down as I would regard correctly, because young and inexperienced musicologists, it's very easy to read books that look very large and firm, but there will be a lot of misinformation in those, and a lot of misinformation on the backs of CDs and LPs. So I would encourage people, please, to read. I mean, I have to update these things because I'm constantly finding out more. But really, in particular, Welte troubles me, that the Welte company clearly had a way of recording dynamics in real time, and there have been such poor representations of how they did it put out in magazines and books. And I would encourage people to read the website and think about it very, very carefully. I would say it just happens to me that I was born with a logical mind, and there are very few ways that these companies could have done this 100 years ago. They didn't have electronics, they didn't have computers. They had to do it in some very basic ways, but there were some very clever engineers around who managed to work these things out. Anyway, enough of the advertisement, that'll do.
Yeah, but I'll put the link to the page and to the journals in the description of this video when I put it online. Yes, another thing that you did during this problematic COVID time was to record all of the Hupfeld rolls that Scriabin made. There is already for many years a CD available with you playing all the Grieg Hupfeld rolls, and together I think with the Grieg Concerto, the Percy Grainger version, performed with a real orchestra. And now you did Scriabin. Was that more complicated than doing Grieg?
There are three things I would say in regard to this. I think it's going to be three. It's either three or four. One is that before I go into playing hand-played rolls, I mean, the term hand-played, as you will know, but and some people won't know this. Hand-played rolls means rolls in theory recorded by a pianist, but without any automatic dynamic coding. So Hupfeld's animatic series is a good example of hand-played rolls. I would say that there are a lot of rolls that came out in America and also Paris, I suspect, which say that they're hand-played rolls, or at least they give the implication that they were recorded by pianists. But you have to be very careful what you're dealing with. Something that is punched at 12 perforation rows per beat is clearly not hand-played. It may be taken from the hand playing of some pianist or other, but it's clearly been reduced back to being a metronomic roll. That was one thing. The other is to say that with all this attention being placed on reproducing pianos and hand-played rolls, one of the most important things about the player piano to me is that the tradition of playing the player piano with metronomic rolls should be kept going. It's very important. It's why the pianola was first developed, and it would worry me if the attention on hand-played and reproducing piano rolls were to suffocate and well, it just cause the pianola in its original form to disappear. It's very difficult to follow a conductor. You have to be very, very accurate. It's not an easy instrument to play, but I hope people won't give up trying, which would be a great pity. There is modern music around, written for pianolas and orchestra and smaller groups, where it's made particularly easy for the orchestra and the pianola player to come in, because they don't have to remain exactly together while they're both playing, and they don't have to come in difficult places. They come in and overlap, and it makes it appear easier. But that's a tradition that I would like to see carried on. Right, now to get on to Scriabin and Grieg. With regard to the Grieg rolls on the CD, which came out from 2L, it's called, I think, isn't it? The company in Norway. I played those with my push-up on an enormous Bösendorfer Grand. And the company that recorded them decided to put microphones under the piano, which I knew nothing about. And indeed, there's the Grieg third violin sonata on there, and neither the violinist nor I knew about these extra microphones. And we were, of course, trying to balance the performance as we could hear it. The difficulty is that it makes the piano rather loud. I would say that and also because it was such a huge piano, it's been much easier playing on Denis's Steck, in Denis Hall's Steck at his home, partly because with an inbuilt player, you can adjust everything so it's right, and you can leave it like that. When you're dealing with a push-up, it's much more difficult because it has to fit in front of a modern toned piano. And anyway, you don't have the time ever in a concert or a recording session to get the fingers set up, every single one, so that they're all just on the point of just touching the black keys and the white keys and so on. So I would say that I'm never happy with anything that I do, be it a CD or a concert. There's always at the end, there's something which I think I could have done better. I've learned a lesson with that because my wife manages conductors, and occasionally I've seen people go to the conductor and they say, that was fantastic. And one or two of the conductors say, well, it was okay, but in this bit, it could have been better because, and so on. And I've learned a lesson, which is that after a concert, if somebody comes backstage and they say, that was fantastic, what they want you to say back is, thank you, because that keeps the atmosphere going for them. But in your own mind, in my own mind, I never, ever feel that anything is quite good enough. There's always something which could be better. And I think that's, in a way, that's a good thing, because you're always then trying to do a little bit better. And so with the Grieg rolls, maybe one day I can have another go to play them on our website, perhaps, but to play them more quietly. Denis is in the process at this moment, well, not this evening, but he's about to be in the process of putting new hammers on parts of the Steck. They are the original hammers that come from 1914 or whatever it is, but the ones at the very top of the piano have got quite hard, and that makes it more difficult to play nowadays, because if you're trying to keep the treble down, then you're going to lose some of the other treble stuff and so on. So there's been slightly that problem with the Scriabin recordings that I've done. It just happened that a young lady wrote to me from the radio station at Harvard, the student radio station, and they wanted to play all Scriabin's music, including all the rolls that he'd recorded, both for Welte and Hupfeld. They took the Welte recordings on the Pierian CD put out by Ken Caswell several years ago, And I said I would get all the other ones recorded for them. I have 13 of Scriabin's Hochfeld rolls. They're out of the 14. I didn't have the one that is currently up on our Pianola Institute, all one word, channel on YouTube. But it's called Feuillet d'Album in the Hochfeld catalogue, which means Albumblatt in German and album leaf in English. I couldn't find it anywhere, but there's a lovely musicologist who's just recently retired from Santa Cruz University in California, Anatol Laikin, who's Russian originally. And he had been to the Scriabin Museum in Moscow, and there they had a number of photocopies because somebody about 20 or 30 years ago had gone to the museum in Moscow with some 73 note rolls, and they had photocopied all of them, all the ones that the person took in. And then whoever it was had gone in, they lost touch, they don't know the name, they don't know where the rolls are, but they arrived in Moscow for a day or whatever, and they were photocopied. Nowadays, they've also lost the photocopies. But the man who ran the museum, who has now died in those days, Pavel, I think it was, Lobanov, he made, from the photocopies, he measured the length of each crotchet, which is each fourth note in American. I'm not sure what it is in German, but he measured all these in 4 beats in a bar. That would be each beat he was measuring. He didn't measure the shorter notes, but he measured those. And he put metronome markings over every fourth note, every crotchet. And Anatol, in one of his books, The Performance Style of Alexander Scriabin, he published these pieces of sheet music. He took the manuscript that Pavel Lobanov must have made, and he turned it into printed form. And I have the book, and for a long while I've thought, really, I should get round to doing that. So I took the metronome markings and the notes, and I turned it back on one of my computers into the old program, my Apple IIe computer, which is 40 years old. And I checked it about a week ago, it's still working. I put it back onto that, and then I used my musical common sense to fill in between the crotchets, so the quavers and the semiquavers and so on. And it's perfectly clear if you're doing that. You don't have too much of a choice. If you don't want it to sound mechanical, it has to flow in a certain way when there's a speeding up or a slowing down and so on. And I perforated the roll. So effectively, I have all 14 rolls now. If somebody finds the original one day, then I can compare it and I can see whether I've made a faithful job or not. But just at the moment, that is the only copy effectively known of that Feuillet d'Album. So I've recorded them all. I will put them out on the Pianola Institute channel during the course of 2022, which is Scriabin's birth year if you work to the Western calendar. He was actually born either in December or January, depending on which calendar you use, the old Russian calendar or the Western one. But for my own convenience, I'll assume he was born in January 2022, and that way I can put these rolls out and say that it's in his centenary year. But I might have a go again at one or two of them. At the moment, I don't know if they're still available on the WHRB website, which is where they were broadcast last week. But they will slowly come out on the Pianola Institute channel. So that the problem with doing these things is that you have to put yourself as far as you can into the character of the person who recorded the rolls. Now, I can try and do that. I know that Scriabin was a gentle playing artist. He was passionate, but he was also quite intimate, probably a little bit like Leopold Godowsky was. He was better with small audiences rather than large ones. And you can see a small audience on the Welte photograph of Scriabin recording for Welte in Moscow, an audience of his friends, essentially. And I would think that probably suited him very well. And there was some talk after he died. Rachmaninoff did a tour playing Scriabin's music, which, you know, it was a kind thing of him to do. But one or two people said, well, yes, all right, but this is Rachmaninoff, who's used to playing in these large venues. And Scriabin was a bit quieter about things. But however you do it, if you're playing hand-played rolls, the result is going to be a portrait and not a photograph, because inevitably you're interpreting these things. So it's like you're a painter painting the way somebody played. I'm 73 years old. Scriabin, when he recorded these rolls, was in his 30s, his late 30s. So am I playing a bit too much like an old man who likes things to be gentle and not too youthful? There's no way of answering that. If I try doing it again, I might try to play a bit, I don't know, more passionately like a younger man would do, but it's very difficult to know. You just have to do the best you can. I have played the Friedheim differently from the Friedheim Liszt Sonata differently from the way I played the Scriabin. So I do sense a difference there. But with Friedheim, there is always the feeling that he was not quite as passionate as Liszt was. He was somebody who took things at a measured pace, and I want it to be a bit more passionate because that's the way the Liszt comes to me. That's the way I hear the Liszt, and it's a very big temptation not to let go of the tempo lever, because it just seems to me in some places in the Friedheim, he doesn't accelerate. You know, what Liszt would be doing is he would be accelerating up to the climax and then holding back for the last note. And Friedheim just takes it at a measured pace, rather. So anyway, it's a black art, you might say. You're trying to be a magician in some ways. But whatever you do, it's better to do that than to be somebody. Well, I would say this will not go down well with some musicologists, but it seems to me the way you get to play these things properly is to listen to the piano playing of a lot of pianists from 100 years ago, but not to make tables and lists of the length of bars and things. If you do that, you don't learn anything. You have to listen to the things and let it get into your soul. Anyway, there we are.
Well, actually, what you tell reminds me so much of the experience that I made myself when dealing with these hand-played rolls as a researcher, but of course also as a performer. And I must admit, I do measurements. I do analyze them on the computer and take a lot of measurements and make a lot of graphs out of them. But on the other hand, I also try to approach these roles as a performer. And for example, with Reinecke's Hupfeld roles, with some of them at least, what I did is I tried to recreate these roles as closely as possible by playing the pieces myself, not on a pianola, but really playing them as a pianist, but as much as possible in Reinecke's style. And the things I learn about the performance of Reinecke by doing that is indeed much greater than by just looking at measurements of the performance. And that sounds to me similar to what you are telling, that how you understand Scriabin's or Friedheim's musicianship and their interpretations through reinterpreting them on the pianola, that this is a different kind, a more involved and yeah, a more musical way of understanding what's going on.
You're making things in real time. You're having to make up a performance in real time. You're not going through it. The difference is that I'm doing it as a pianolist. There were people who edited reproducing piano rolls, lots of them in different companies all over the years, who had to do it one note at a time, because the vast majority of reproducing piano rolls, there was no automatic dynamic recording. None at all, really. I mean, well, there was, that's another big subject. There was with Welte, there was an inadequate one, I would say, with Hupfeld and the Dea. There was a much better one with Philips and the Duca, because they took, what I think happened is that they took Welte's early recording system and they altered it. They gave themselves extra things so that musical editors could put the salt and pepper, if you like, into the music. They could just bring out little accents exactly as they wanted to, or if necessary, they could make it a little bit quieter. But that was a bit less subtle than the accents. But the Duca, it seems to me, is the best criticism we have, the best contemporary criticism in those days of the Welte system. The fact that Philips decided they needed to put in these extra little accents is a sure sign that the Welte itself didn't do that. That was the one point where it failed. It couldn't quite do the detail well enough, and somebody, probably Willy Rehberg or somebody who was recording a lot for the Duca, some pianist whom they trusted, went through and said, well, this is what you need to do. But then the Ampico on the whole, no matter the Ampico, Charles Stoddart, who invented the Ampico, was wonderful at publicity. He was a sort of reproducing piano politician. He could always say things in the way that sounded best. But I have to say, they could not record dynamics in any way that could then be converted, except by mountains of work, to the coding that they needed for the reproducing pianos. And they had to have lots and lots and lots of musical technicians working on those. And as soon as you do that, and it's not in real time, it's a hell of a task to have to accomplish. And and the danger is that it won't sound like the original recording. And the Duart, exactly the same. They had these dials because they wanted to be pedaling a pianola in real time, which would have been ideal, but they couldn't do that because they lost a legal case. And instead, the Angelus R Trio used that system. But they had to have these dials and then go through afterwards, trying to make the things sound reasonable. And I would say, well, anyway, I understand very clearly what it is that you're doing with the rolls, and good luck to you. And I would say, learn the pianola and get to the point where you can do it in real time. Because if you can play the piano, it doesn't always follow, but if you can play the piano and let's say accompany somebody with a pianola, then you're in a very good position, because you can then pedal the rolls and you can think about it as you listen to it in real time.
Yeah, so I think we can turn toward the roll that we're going to listen to in the end. And I would like to say first that I'm so glad that you are willing to participate in this series, because I was a bit afraid that after me putting online now more than 2 weeks of digitized piano rolls played on virtual instruments that you would not want to speak to me anymore at all, because and I would like to use the opportunity to say one thing, that why we put this online in this form. It should be very clear that we have absolutely no intention of claiming that these digital reproductions should in any way replace real instruments and replace playing the roles on real instruments. It is something that is mainly for scientific, for analytical purposes, and the main advantage that I see in the digital reproductions is their comparability, so that we can, when we go from a scan to an emulation and then to a digitally realized MP3 file, we can do that in exactly the same way for all the roles. And for someone who wants to analyze the recordings with as a researcher with some scientific claims to have all of them reproduced under exactly the same circumstances, purely digital, is something that is important, and that's why I'm doing it, and it gives a good basis for this kind of analysis.
I agree with you. I mean, I do think it's a good idea, but there are two points I think I would make. One is that any computer emulator is equivalent to a single piano. It's not universal any more than any individual piano is, and it will be the performance that comes out will be defined by the people who have designed the emulator effectively.
Or to be more precise, the emulator software is just one way of setting up the expression system on the reproducing piano. And then the second step is running the emulated MIDI file through a virtual piano software. And there again, this is one setup that I chose carefully. I think I chose it with good reasons. To bring out a lot of details of the roles and also to allow a very clear and focused analytical hearing of the roles. But again, it's one choice. And with putting up these files not only as MP3 files, on the contrary, I would say the MP3 files are nice to listen to, but if you want to do analysis based upon our scans, it's better to turn to the MIDI files and not so, because you can analyze the things in much greater detail when you turn to the MIDI files, and then you have the opportunity to run these MIDI files to a completely differently set up virtual piano if you like. And if you want a completely different sound, you can do this on the basis of the emulated files.
Yes, what nobody has done yet, it seems to me, no one anywhere in the world, is analyze what happens with the suction inside reproducing pianos. They all do it from test rolls, but nobody has taken suction meters and placed them everywhere inside a reproducing piano for one roll, hundreds of times, taking those readings everywhere. Because as soon as a note plays, I mean, the reproducing pianos vary according to the type of valve systems that they have in them. Welte were a little bit better, that as notes play, the suction tends to stay roughly at the same level, but it doesn't do it completely. Duart, the suction definitely goes down as soon as notes play, as the valves lift and let air in and so on. Nobody has been through, you can't run a reproducing piano according to the test roll. You can if it's a piano. You can set up the test roll because the rolls were made for the pianos as they existed. But if you use the test roll to inform an emulator which does not have valves, without having first analyzed exactly what happens to a roll as it's playing, then you're dealing always with static suction levels and so on. But Denis and I did it once. I made a special roll. I can't got it. It was a simple roll. It was a march roll on the duo art, and I did connect a suction reader, which was connected into a digital to analog converter and so on, or an analog to digital converter, beg your pardon. And I managed to get a system where I could print a roll out. I mean, this is in the early 1990s, I think, so it was fairly basic. And you could see a graph of what was happening to the suction as the notes played and how it recovered and all the rest of it. But these things are, I mean, it's also affected by the use of the sustaining pedal. It's affected by how many notes are playing, or how many have been playing or about to play, and all that stuff. And I would plead with the musicological world to get together with their technicians and to get player pianos working. You can't store player pianos in broom cupboards. They have to be there in decent sized music rooms, not in concert halls. And they have to be got to work really well. And then you analyze them, and then you can start using that for the basis of making improved emulators and so on. But it's something that nobody's done, and nobody's really bitten on that, and that seems to be needs to be done. Anyway,
though we would then need to discuss whether these fluctuations in the suction that occur within the system, whether they are something that the editors of the dynamics were aware of and considered when they were doing the perforations, the codings for the dynamics.
Of course they were. The roll editors edited until the thing sounded right. So there's no point with these reproducing pianos in trying to make them sound better than they originally were, because you can't. The best you can aim for is what the roll editors could hear as they were editing. And that implies a whole load of things. But whether or not they were aware of the fact that, well, they wouldn't have been necessarily, that the coding was doing this and that, they would nevertheless have heard it, and they would have edited the coding until it sounded right.
I think it's time to announce the roll now.
Yes, of course.
We're going to hear Karl Reinecke playing Beethoven's Ecossaisen. It's actually not Beethoven's music entirely. It's a concert arrangement that Reinecke made of what Beethoven wrote, but in a very subtle way, I think. And he published this also as a score. I will put a link to the score in the description as well. The wonderful thing is, we in this series now over the last few weeks, we try to devote every second or third day to a roll with music by Beethoven. And Karl Reinecke, he was not the first one to record any Beethoven. That was Eugénie Adam Bénard for Welte. But Reinecke was the oldest pianist, or the earliest born pianist who ever recorded something by Beethoven.
And he was alive. He was born before Beethoven died.
Yes, he was the only recorded pianist who was born during Beethoven's lifetime in 1824. So he was beyond 80 when he recorded for Welte, but you don't hear that. And it's a lovely roll, a very personal way of playing Beethoven, of approaching Beethoven. And I think it's nice to have this, although this is a rather well-known roll and it has been released before on some CDs or so, to have this again in the lovely reproduction on Denis Hall's Steinway, and to have this in the series just because it's the oldest pianist who ever recorded anything by Beethoven.
I enjoy Karl Reinecke's playing. I enjoy it for its own sake. I enjoy it because I think it provides a much safer bridge to early piano playing than just jumping back to the early part of the 19th century. If you want to go to the early 19th century, you have to go through the early 20th century and the late and mid 19th century. And I think listening to Reinecke is a very good start at doing that. He's such a bridge between, such a wonderful bridge between the early part of the 19th and the late 19th.
I think that's a wonderful thought to end our interview with, and to start listening to Reinecke's short roll of the Beethoven Ecossaisen. Rex, thank you so much for your time. And I hope we'll very soon have the chance to see each other again in person when the COVID situation improves a bit. And I also hope that we can see you next year at the Pianola meeting in Bern, if the situation allows it. So thank you so much for your time, and see you soon.
And thank you too.